Ladies and gentlemen, we have a new fusion that was just announced earlier today, and this is going to be Ishiyama, the Immovable, a new Shadowkin legendary HP-based damage dealer whose kit we're going to be going over a little bit, but I actually want to tell you guys, you are right. You read the title, you read the thumbnail correctly. I am going for this guy, and I think that most players should be, and we're going to talk about why. Let's go ahead. Let's take a look at his kit just real quick, because every YouTuber has already earned their paycheck by covering this guy in depth and offering their very, very well-informed thoughts on it. So Burning Comet A1 attacks one enemy 2 times, each hit transferring a random debuff from him to the target. If this champion is under any debuffs when attacked, counterattacks with this skill. This is actually very strong, and the reason for this is when you're transferring that debuff, it's basically going to cleanse it from you and then try to place it on an enemy, which means that it's essentially just kind of a pseudo cleanse. So we see something like this with Lysandra, for example, her A1, always reflecting back those annoying pesky debuffs, right? Very, very strong, especially in lower level arena where you're not going against, you know, resistance-centric teams, or you're not going against teams that always have block debuffs and those sorts of things. So this is a way to get rid of those fears and everything like that that might be placed by somebody like a Fabian, for example. This is a way of getting rid of any sort of like a soft CC like that, right? So predominantly fears. The rest of them are going to kind of stop this from working. It's also good for getting rid of decreased defense, weakens, anything that's going to help to make you weaker, right? You're now putting that on the enemy, which is very cool. Calculated Volley A2 AoE, 100% chance of placing a fear, a decreased crit damage, and decreased crit rate debuff on all enemies for 2 turns. These debuffs cannot be resisted by enemies who are already under 2 or more debuffs. Here's the thing, guys. Here's the thing. So this is an AoE on an HP-based champion. This is most likely going to do some decent damage, again, especially for, you know, players that might not be cracking accounts or at the end of the game. The issue that's being made right now, and the issue that a lot of CCs are... So essentially, the issue that I have with the videos they're making is going to be the way to say this, is that they're approaching it from an extremely Kraken point of view. There's always new players coming into the game, and this is something that we all have to consider, right? There's always new players coming into the game. There's always returning players coming into the game who might not have played for 6 months. I was once one of those players, right? I left for like 6 or 8 months or something like that because I got tired of where the game was. There's always an influx of new accounts, and having an AoE with a fear on a 100% land rate is already pretty solid, right? Because that's going to make your dungeon runs so much more easy, or so much easier would be the right way to say that. That's going to make your faction wars a lot more consistent and easy to get through. And don't get me wrong, there's going to be some very solid points to this apart from, oh, new player good, right? Bear with me. So he's then also placing a decreased crit damage, which is also fairly solid, more so specifically for PvP, because you're going to say, hey, 25% of your crit damage is now gone. So in late game, we have champions that are now pushing like 400 crit damage on these mythical champions, right? So that's immediately just going to erase 100% of that crit damage, right? So it's going to take away 100%, not erase all of it, just for clarification. On top of that, he's placing a 30% decreased crit rate. Now, in PvE, if you're not familiar, almost every mob, every boss has a 15% crit rate. So what does this mean? Well, mathematically speaking, you're at negative 15% crit rate now on these enemies, which means that you cannot be critical hit. Now, I don't know if people remember this because it was a long time ago and we have so many cheese strats now, but there are players who still struggle to complete clan boss daily, right? Especially at a nightmare, ultra nightmare level. There's players who are going to struggle inside Chimera, inside Hydra. So taking away the critical hit capabilities from boss content is going to go so far to helping make sure that your team survives, that this guy actually turns into a pretty strong candidate for that alone. Because again, he's taking away their crit damage, he's taking away their crit rate, he's putting fears on them, right? If it's some sort of a mob that can be feared, so for example, like the Ice Golem adds, right? There you go, perfect example. That's just for PvE. You take this guy into PvP, this guy is going to be a menace, an HP-based damage dealer inside like bronze, silver, and low gold arenas is going to be pretty crazy. And this guy is going to be a very strong counter for your Force Affinity champions. So champions like, for example, Harima springs to mind, right? She's a Force Affinity champion. He's going to be neutral affinity against somebody like a Sun Wukong, whereas sometimes your Magic Affinity champions, your Force Affinity champions can struggle with that, right? So decent options there. Now, finish them. A3, 3-turn cooldown, will ignore 25% of the target's defense. Will ignore 50% of the target's defense instead if they're under 2 or more debuffs, placing a block damage on him for 2 turns if the attack kills an enemy. Now, the one issue with this is that it's not a 2x hitter, and it's a very conditional 50% defense ignore. I think he would have been astronomically better, because I don't think he's a very endgame viable champion. Let me be clear about that, right? But I think that everybody, even endgame players, should be going for him. He would have been astronomically better, and he would have been endgame viable if this was a 2x hitter that just straight up ignored 50% of defense, because then you can use him to get around something like a UDK. You can use him to get around something like a Rotos, right? Having those multiple hitters. Even if this smacks, it's going to be so easily countered by something like a UDK that he basically just falls flat immediately. So this part of his kit definitely isn't, you know, too crazy. Now, the thing to consider with this is that he's already been released, pseudo-released, right? So we already know his skills. Plarium aren't going to change him. They've never changed a fusion before it was released. The only exception being Eurogrim, who is an overpowered champion, is a part of like the underside of the fusion, if that makes sense. So you'd have to get him and fuse him. It's a whole story. But finally, we have the immovable part, the passive. Whenever an enemy resists a debuff placed by this champion, the next debuff placed by this champion cannot be resisted. Each debuff placed by this champion increases max HP by 3%, scaling up to 30. Now, let me tell you something, guys. If there was a fusion released today that said each time this champion does something, like let's say that we're looking at Sun Wukong's kit, right? Let's say each time he places a block buffs, increases his attack up to 30%, all of these content creators would be telling you that that champion was the best thing since sliced bread. Right? Simple as that. They'd be like, oh my god, this guy is so good. He's a must fuse. Everybody has to get him. Fuse him today. Here's my test server video. That's all you would hear. That's all you would see. That's what the community sentiment would be. So having an already most likely pretty tanky HP-based champion get 30% more HP is pretty crazy. This is pretty damn nutty. If we think about some of the other HP-based damage dealers, right? So if we think about Eric's, Taurus, if we think about Magnar at an epic level, anybody who's doing damage based off of HP, if we had them scaling up 30% more HP, they would be a very, very, very strong contender for some of the best champions inside the game at their respective rarities, right? So this is incredibly strong, scaling himself over time. It's not going to take that long to get there, right? So if we look at his A2, let's say we're in arena, we have the accuracy to land this, or they don't have much resistance, right? This is 3 debuffs spreading over 4 enemies. That's already 12 debuffs. That is 12 debuffs going out, which is going to proc this 12 times, essentially, right? So 12 times 3 is 36. He can only stack up to 30. That being said, though, one time he goes with his A2, if he places all those debuffs on at least 4 enemies, he's already got the stack of 30% max HP. Crazy. Now, if you're using him inside the Hydra, right, he obviously can't place the Fear, so he can still place the decreased crit damage and decreased crit rate, which then means that he can essentially, you know, get that a little bit slower, but he'll still be able to get it very efficiently. And finally, the Burning Comet A1, if you have any sort of fears placed on you or those sorts of things, not necessarily fears, because again, it's either, you know, it procs or it doesn't, but also the Hydra is placing poisons on you. It's placing decreased defenses, it's placing weakens and all those sorts of things. So he can definitely help out with making sure that those debuffs get sent back where they came from. I don't recall off the top of my head if it places decreased defense, but I know it places the weakens, right? Which is just nasty stuff that you don't want on your team. So then finally, he has an aura of ally HP in all battles by 28%. Now, by now, I very solidly made my case why this guy is going to be useful for early to mid-game people, right? Players. Why should end-game players be going for him? Why will I be going for him? Why will you be going for him, hopefully, after seeing this video? Well, it's very simple, and there's a few potential reasons for it. So first of all, it's a fragment fusion, which are some of the easiest fusions to complete. So if you have that collect them all mentality, this is going to be a fairly easy fusion for you to get through. Second of all, There's obviously going to be some sort of a Titan's Path or guaranteed event at the end where you'll most likely be able to get up to a 5-star awakening for this guy. So if he does turn out to be a competent damage dealer, you can then have 5 stars of awakening levels on him that you can use to push through Cursed City, right? Cursed City is some of the most important content to be farming right now. And this guy is undoubtedly going to show up in some of the awakened stages, and having that awakening is just going to make it so much easier for the rest of your team to get their job done, right? You'll need to worry about less awakenings across less champions. It's going to be a win-win. And finally, if you don't yet have High Mother Mod, the legendary that you can fuse fragments into, essentially, you can simply go for this guy. Ignore, say, for example, the summoning events, right? So let's take Dungeon Divers, take our tournaments for, like Dragon, Ice Golem, all that sort of stuff. Let's take our gear enhancement. You can get anywhere between 70 to 90 fragments for a legendary champion without summoning a single shard during these fusions, which is pretty crazy. Those can then straight up be just converted into chests to try and get your High Mother Mod. Again, if you haven't finished her, she looks to be a pretty decent champion. That's an extremely good use case for this guy without spending too many of your resources, even if you don't fully go for him and complete the fusion. And even if you do complete the fusion, you still have the option to just sit on him and wait and see if he's useful before doing that exchange, right? And finally, the other important thing to consider that nobody is talking about, which is funny because when you're a content creator, you're privy to information that regular people don't have, right? So they know that Hard Faction Wars is coming. They've made videos talking about Hard Faction Wars. We all know it's coming because it's in the next What's Next in Raid video that we put out at this point. Now, 2 weeks ago, those videos were put out saying, oh, Hard Faction Wars was coming. Oh, this is going to be great content. And then also in those videos, they said, oh, well, there's going to be conditions that we have to meet in order to 3-star certain stages. That's how we get to next mythical. What if one of the conditions for the Shadowkin faction is to place a decreased crit rate or a decreased crit damage on the boss? And even furthermore, what if that boss has exceptionally high resistance? So you may need a champion that can place those debuffs and they cannot be resisted.